In 15th century Italy, the cunning
Caterina Sforza
ruthlessly defended her family's fortunes at any cost, and was even accused of plotting to assassinate the Pope. When enemies laid siege to her fortress, captured her children and threatened to slit their throats, she stood on the walls of Imola and lifted her skirts, calling out to them to do it, because she could always make more children. Some historians praise her as one of the most remarkable women in history, who achieved great things, while others put her in a different category, as a brutal dictator and tyrant. According to one modern historian, Caterina Sforza was hated because she did what men did, and did it triumphantly. Something one also could say about Joan of Arc, who Caterina have been compared to by many. This is the life of the incredible Caterina Sforza.
Questa è la storia del Rinascimento con Magnus.
Caterina Sforza's grandfather, Francesco Sforza, was a
condottiero,
or a captain for hire. In the mid-15th century, Sforza took a gamble and seized power for himself in Milan. His move made the Sforzas the Dukes of Milan, for as long as they could hold on to power. In 1463, Francesco's son Galeazzo Maria had a child with his best friend's wife. The illegitimate girl was named Caterina Sforza. When her father became Duke of Milan in 1466, he brought his children to the court. As the daughter of Milan's Duke, Caterina received a Renaissance education. She read the works of prominent humanists and learned how to fight alongside her brothers. And the Sforza family had plans for her. She would marry well and build connections with more established families, because still new to power, the Sforzas longed for legitimacy. Her parents conveyed their passion for warfare and hunting, but most important of all, they taught her the art of ruling, and Caterina was a very willing student, learning all the tricks in the Renaissance ruler's handbook. No, not that one, that book hadn't been written yet, and this was something Caterina would put to good use later. Caterina was barely 10 years old when she got betrothed to Girolamo Riario, who was 29 at the time. Riario was harsh and immoral, but Sforza's family considered him a proper match because of his good qualities, like the fact that his uncle was the Pope Sixtus IV. Well, that's pretty much his only good quality. According to Niccolo Machiavelli, Riario was a being of very low and vile condition. Caterina's wedding was not off to a great start. Her husband Riario couldn't make it to Milan, so the marriage took place by proxy. Since there was no Skype or Zoom at the time, this meant that another person represented him and took his vows. When she was 13 and he was 32, they consummated their marriage and was now legally man and wife. But right before the marriage, tragedy had struck. Her father was assassinated. Historians believe that 3 men did the deed, each for different reasons. One was fighting with the Duke over some land, another hated the Duke's politics, while the third had a personal grudge. Girolamo Riario and his young wife Caterina Sforza later settled in Rome, where Riario had become the right-hand man for the Pope. Her husband immediately forbade his wife from participating in politics. But the joke was on him. Because Caterina wasn't going to be stopped by this and quickly gained popularity among Roman aristocracy who admired her for her intelligence, spirit, and beauty. As for Riario, well, everyone hated him, and several people tried to kill him, though without success. Meanwhile, during the first years of their marriage, Riario plotted against the powerful Medici family of Florence. He helped plan a failed assassination attempt in 1478 which enraged the Medici. The Pope's lands, which included Imola, bordered the Medici territories in Tuscany, meaning all-out warfare would soon erupt. I made a video about the Medici family, there's a link in the description below. But the death of Pope Sixtus IV in August 1484 suddenly changed the couple's fortunes for the much worse. While the fight over who was going to be the new pope now exploded, mobs attacked and plundered the houses of the old pope's relatives and allies, including the Riario residence. Caterina took matters into her own hands to protect her family. 7 months pregnant, leaped onto a horse and secured Castle Sant'Angelo in the name of the next pope with her troops. As she stormed the fortress, she wore a satin dress and a velvet hat, arrived wielding a sword and carrying a bag of gold coins, and simply refused to leave. She was determined to give the castle back, only to the newly elected pope. But the cardinals immediately went to her husband Riario with a plea deal. Being the great guy he was, he accepted it almost immediately and then demanded that Caterina vacate the fortress. Caterina was very disappointed by the betrayal of her husband. But later that year, Girolamo Riario fell ill, leaving Caterina in charge of running Imola and Forli. Conspiracies against the weak Riario now popped up like mushrooms after a rainy night in the forest. Sforza doled out harsh penalties to the plotters, calling for their public quartering, and soon heads lined the gates of Forli to warn others not to attack the ruling family. This was in retaliation of Girolamo's involvement in the Pazzi conspiracy against the ruling Medici family in Florence. Girolamo Riario was an intended beneficiary of the plot. Once Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici had been killed, Riario would have become Lord of Florence, but the plot failed. On the night of April 14, 1488, while Caterina was caring for the children with the nanny and the servants, a man of the noble Orsi family, that was a rich and important family of Forli, assaulted the Riario palace. Girolamo was stabbed to death and thrown out of the window. His corpse was eventually dismembered by the wild crowd. The Orsi then took Caterina and her children prisoner. Except Sforza had an ace up her sleeve, because her trusted guard Giacomo Fio refused to negotiate with her captors or give up her fortress, so Sforza suggested that she could convince her friend Fio to submit, if the Orsis let her go. They agreed, but it was a huge mistake, because even though her children were still being held hostage, Caterina turned on the Orsis anyway. The story says that the Orsi were threatening to kill her sons that they had as hostages, if she didn't give up the castle. Her response was legendary.
Fatelo, se volete. Impiccateli pure davanti a me. Qui ho quanto basta per farne altri.
The conspirators realized their mistake too late and were forced to give up, something that would cost them dearly. Unfortunately, there is no proof that this really happened, and historians are divided on whether to believe this story or not. I'll come back to that later in this presentation. Caterina's rage over her traitors and families was terrifying. She was not content with just executing the conspirators, she wanted them to die terrible deaths and tortured them endlessly before murdering them. Her lust for revenge didn't stop there. She extended her fury on their wives, mistresses, and even their children. Around 20 children, including infants, were killed in her aftermath. But in this way, Caterina had made a foolish mistake, because during her rampage of rage, she killed many current or potential allies, and her rage would later cost her dearly. She now also took complete control, by becoming the ruling regent for her son. At only 25 years old, Caterina had achieved more than most people do in a lifetime, and now she was a woman ruling alone. She ruthlessly stamped out dissent, tracked down her husband's killers and hanged them all. Following the assassination of her first husband, she appointed Giacomo Fio, a handsome stable groom in her household, to be the castellan of the fortress in Forli. Fio and Sforza became lovers and they married in secret, so she could avoid the possibility of losing custody of her children and the regency. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became the new pope, Alexander VI, which was supposed to be good news for Caterina. He was godfather to her son Ottaviano. But, much like her, the Pope was a crafty man of action and just as scheming as Sforza. In the late 15th century, France and Spain were locked into a war inside Italy. Caterina cleverly started playing both countries off each other. But, double agents and double crossings don't always end well, as we will see later. The chronicles and diplomatic dispatches of the period reported that Caterina was very much in love with Fio, and it was feared that she would give political precedence and power to him, passing over her eldest son and Riario's heir, Ottaviano. These fears led to two failed conspiracies to assassinate Fio and Sforza. The third conspiracy, however, organized by Giovanni Antonio Getty, finally succeeded in killing Fio on August 27, 1495, when he and Caterina and their entourage were returning to Forlì from a hunting trip. As they approached the Schiavonia gate into Forlì, Theo was cut off from the others by the conspirators, stabbed and beaten to death. Caterina, however, was able to escape to the safety of Ravaldino. Giovanni Antonio Getty thought he would be regarded as a liberator of the city, but Caterina Sforza responded swiftly to avenge Theo's murder. 38 people were executed for the crime, including Getty and his wife and children, and many others were imprisoned or exiled. In 1499, Sforza gained a formidable enemy, Pope Alexander VI himself. This didn't just sting because of the enormous power held by the Pope, but because Caterina and the Pope used to be on pretty good terms, hence the whole godfather of my son thing. But for the Pope, his own family mattered more than his godchildren, and they now threatened Caterina Sforza's territories in central Italy. Pope Alexander was allied with the French king to claim Sforza's region of Romagna for his own son, Cesare Borgia. The Pope claimed that Caterina's rule was illegal because her land belonged to the Church. It was a cold-hearted betrayal by her former ally. But Caterina wasn't friendless, and now had a new powerful connection. While the powerful Florentine family, the Medici, had historically been enemies to the Sforza family, Caterina had struck up a relationship with Giovanni de' Medici, had an out-of-wedlock child with him, and then married him. Their son would be none other than the father of Cosimo de' Medici, the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. While Caterina was busy protecting her territory, tragedy was about to strike again. Her husband Giovanni de' Medici got sick, and when Caterina learned about his weak condition, she was devastated. She was with him when he passed away in September that year. Despite her recent setbacks, Caterina rallied and came through for her people. She kept the Venetians at bay, and after several attempts, they had to retreat and find another way to get into Florence. This defense of her city earned Caterina a truly impressive title. She was now
La Tigre,
the tiger. Caterina believed she could count on the rest of Giovanni's family to support her, yet when the Borgias finally struck the city of Florence, the Medici family was exiled, and Caterina had lost her support. Niccolò Machiavelli reported that the proud and bold Caterina withstood the siege alone, being admired for that all over Italy, but nobody came to help her. Despite defending the city, the citizens, tired of her tyranny and fear for the French army, surrendered to Cesare Borgia without a fight. Caterina was far from impressed, but it only made her even more resolved to defend her lands for herself. The tigress sealed herself inside the fortress where the Borgia troops had a very difficult time touching her. In the midst of battle, Cesare figured he'd try to negotiate with the tiger, but she simply refused to listen. Cesare Borgia kept bombing her stronghold, and Caterina fought with sword in hand and even went so far as to set the place on fire. But, realizing she was about to be overrun, she tried one last trick. Knowing that the French refused to take female prisoners of war, she tried to surrender to them, rather than to Cesare Borgia. However, Cesare was just as crafty as Caterina. He stopped the plot by convincing the French general that he would treat Caterina as a guest and not as a prisoner. Instead, he totally went back on his word and imprisoned her for 5 months. After the tigress attempted an escape, things only got worse and she was confined in an even stricter prison. Finally, in 1501, the rebellious Caterina Sforza was free. Sadly, her freedom had a terrible cost. The Pope insisted Caterina signed away her lands to his son, Cesare Borgia. After signing away her land, Caterina made one last attempt to regain control. After Pope Alexander died, she rode back into town, hoping to become the tigress once more. But it didn't end well. The citizens of Forlì hadn't forgotten her cruelty and vengeance a few years earlier, and they preferred the Ordelaffi family to come back and take control. This was the end for Caterina as a ruler, and she gave up ruling over the Romagna region forever, and moved to Florence and the Medici family. She now dedicated herself to her children's education and her alchemy experiments. In the final years of her life, she confided to a monk.
Se io potessi scrivere tutto, farei stupire il mondo.
In 1509, Caterina Sforza started to feel unwell. Even though doctors tended to the tigress, no one could have known that it was already too late. The warrior woman passed away in 1509 due to a liver disease combined with peritonitis and pleurisy. She was only 46 years old at the time. She was buried in the Murate monastery, but unfortunately her grave has been lost. Caterina Sforza has been a subject of many different opinions. Some historians praise her resourcefulness and boldness, while others slam her as a dictator and tyrant. There is no denying that she was a woman who knew what she wanted and was unafraid to get it by any means. She definitely did not fit in with the ideals of the Renaissance woman, for better or for worse. According to one modern historian, Sforza was hated because she did what men did, and she did it triumphantly. Something one also could say about Joan of Arc, who Caterina have been compared to by many. When it comes to the lifting of the dress thing, I personally think the story is true. It seems like something a strong and ruthless woman, born into a world dominated by men, like her could do. And putting this into the context of the Renaissance, it would, in my opinion, have been a very strange thing for people to invent her doing, something that was so taboo at the time. But what do you think about Caterina Sforza? Brave and resourceful, or a ruthless and vengeful woman? Please leave a comment below, and if you found this presentation interesting, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I cover a lot of different history on my channel, so please check out my other videos to see if there are some topics you find interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one.